Hello and welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and it's great to see you here. Media education in India is a sunrise sector on an otherwise dark horizon. There are hundreds of journalism schools across the country, but serious media academic research is an exception. Nothing is measured professionally or consistently. Only the most banal trends are studied, and there is not one single proper media journal worth its name. The result is that the impact of media in India is mostly a matter of opinion and anecdote, not quantifiable facts vetted by scholars. It's easy to see where the problem lies. J schools in India are mostly assembly lines churning out industry-ready products each year. The managements and the faculty, for the most part, are not over-interested in producing anything substantive. And as always in India, there's that big question, who is really interested in these things? To understand the gap in Indian media academics, it's instructive to look at the curriculum vitae of my guest for JPod today, Professor S. Shyam Sundar. A PhD from Stanford University, Shyam is a professor of media effects at Penn State University in Pennsylvania and the founding director of its Media Effects Research Laboratory. Identified as the most published author of internet-related research during the medium's first decade, Shyam's work investigates the social and psychological effects of digital media, from websites and social media to smartphones and robots. He is the editor of the first ever handbook of the psychology of communication technology. He has served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, and he has served on the editorial board of at least 18 other journals. And he has testified before US Congress on technology issues on numerous occasions. In short, Professor Shyam Sundar's CV is 83 pages long. Not bad going at all for the mechanical engineer who wrote music reviews at CityTab magazine in Bangalore. Separated by 3 years, 3 days and 3 roads, Shyam joins me today from his home in State College to discuss the role of social media during the COVID pandemic. Shyam, namaskara to you.
Namaskara.
It's a real honor that you could find the time to join me on this podcast all the way from Pennsylvania.
My pleasure.
Trust you've been doing well, and State College, where Penn State University is located, I hope it's been safe and happy and healthy in these last few days and weeks.
Yep, very much so. We call ourselves Happy Valley, and thankfully the cases are somewhat lower than what we had feared initially.
Well, that's great to hear, and I hope you stay safe and happy and healthy. And so these past few weeks, Shyam, have been a moment of introspection for the whole world, even for wise professors, I presume. And I think you had the chance to step back and look at the big picture. How does it all look for you from your vantage position just now? What has caught your eye and your attention in terms of news media production and consumption? Has it been as you expected, or has there been something unexpected you've seen in these last few weeks?
Well, I think this is probably the biggest event in most of our lives. Most adults now, I think, if you look back at our lives, the most dramatic thing that has occurred to us is probably this event where we've all been kind of locked up or locked down for weeks on end. And this certainly is the classic definition of disruption, if you will. So we talk about disruption in all walks of life these days, especially in technology, about how technology or new innovations are very disruptive. This is kind of a disruption in our life, in our lifestyle, with lots of changes that I think will inevitably be permanent. In some ways, it's a kind of a forced experiment in looking at how life might be when it is almost completely online or non-face-to-face. And I think we, as human beings, are realizing the extent to which we can do a lot of things that we thought were essentially face to face, but we could do them online. But there are also certain areas where we realize the importance of physical human contact as well. So I think we come away with a deeper appreciation of kind of the basic mammalian instincts of touching and feeling and hugging, but also our kind of resilience in trying to make do with online and other mediated forms of communication and getting work done.
Mm-hmm. But what has struck you from a distance about news media production, consumption? What have you noticed? Even from a distance, even from secondhand sources, what have you noticed?
Sure. Yeah. I think news always is at a premium when it comes to major events, often disasters or major shootings in this country, at least. Draw a lot of attention from the public in terms of news. So most people who don't even bother with news on a regular basis crowd around the TV set or tune into the radio and of course go online frenetically to get more information. So there's a lot more kind of hunger for news. There's a lot more active kind of seeking out of news that's going on among the people. And news media themselves are, I think, rising to the occasion. They're trying their best. They're doing all kinds of bootstrapping through traditional, bypassing traditional means of news production to get the news products out. And you see most reporters and editors are working remotely from their homes and still managing to put out a product. The biggest, of course, problem is, even as the appetite for news is increasing, as the readership is increasing, the viewership of stories are increasing, the business itself is at the verge of faltering and tipping over because of lack of advertising revenue, which is the fundamental lifeblood of most news organizations, because they don't survive on readership as much as they depend on advertising dollars. And because of that, because stores are closed, because businesses are closed and advertisers are not exactly spending money advertising products that they don't have any means of selling at this time, the news business has suffered kind of as an indirect consequence. But in terms of public consumption of news, especially younger people's consumption of news, I've seen a definite upswing in recent weeks. And even among my undergraduates, these are people who are pursuing their bachelor's degree in the US. They tend not to consult traditional news. Most of them are kind of the mindset of news finds me, which is that I don't go tune into evening news on TV or read a newspaper every morning. If news is important enough, it's going to find me somehow or the other through my social media channels. And so they have been used to that kind of mindset, but now I'm seeing a greater kind of tendency for active information seeking on their part. So some of those habits of information seeking and news consumption have changed as a result.
How has your own consumption changed?
Well, I'm obviously over-consuming, like a lot of people. And in general, I feel like my intellectual curiosity kind of draws me deeper and deeper into especially the health realm, an area that I obviously am not trained in or don't have any particular technical expertise or background, but I suddenly feel like I'm learning so much more about virology, about vaccinations, about epidemiology, things that as a person who's done doctoral studies, you kind of know at the back of your mind about the research methods underlying it, but you never stop to think about how you have to go through all these different phases of testing before vaccine becomes official, and why this actually would take so much longer than what we human beings instinctively want this to happen. And so these are all really basics of research methods, which I'm now seeing myself apply from the social sciences to kind of more the life sciences, and seeing kind of the value in it. Yeah.
Shyam, in your fabulous, awe-inspiring career, I was I was noticing that your CV, which is now currently available on the PSU website, is 83 pages long. So, in your fabulous career, you worked at the intersection of technology, media, and psychology, actually on different continents. What is the
Mhm.
role you think online media has played in the lives of people, young and old, rich and poor, American and Korean and Indian during these weeks? I mean, what do you think online media, what role has it played, do you think?
I think there are several ways in which we can look at online media in a time like this. The primary kind of gratification that a lot of people get from online media is a sense of community. A lot of people are going to online media, especially online social media, to be together with other people, to kind of commiserate in kind of the same, because we are all in the same situation,
Mm,
just like you and I are at home, in a way, kind of stranded. And so a lot of the whole world finds itself in this kind of state, and that's one commonality. So we can celebrate that kind of commonality, and you see particular types of social media like TikTok, coming to the fore at a time like this, where ordinary people who don't have much expertise and who don't care too much about the kind of creative self-presentation, just put out these 10-second videos, and then others get to kind of share in that moment. So that's, for me, been the primary kind of use of online media by the masses, is because in the last 10-15 years, what we've seen is an explosion of user-generated content in online media, and so much so that has far surpassed the professionally generated content in online media. And previously, when we used to talk about online media back in the day, when I was first doing my research on online media, I was thinking of this more like another medium, just like we have broadcast and print and the traditional mass media. I was thinking of online as another vehicle for news information, and it still is for a lot of news media. And as you know from being in the business, a
yeah.
lot of the news these days come out online. But I think that has become somewhat secondary. But that still is, I think, after community building, the next biggest thing is information seeking that people do online. And the combination of this whole user generated content and the fact that people are going to online media for news rather than subscribing to newspapers or watching TV news has given rise to all kinds of kind of misinformation being consumed without adequate gatekeeping, and that has, of course, resulted in negative outcomes. So on the one hand, community is great, but on the other hand, online media's provision of information, often misinformation, is problematic at many levels.
I presume you don't have a TikTok account, right?
I do. I do have a TikTok, and I do. Well, the whole magic about TikTok is the algorithm. It's so clever that
Uh-huh.
it immediately, within seconds, adjusts to what your taste is. So it never lets you go. So even after you finish one 6-second video, it immediately pops another one, which is just irresistible, and then another one, and so forth. And so it kind of it becomes an endless loop.
Mm.
But again, it's mostly just for kind of watching others, and also to kind of share each other's experiences, and not so much for information.
Yeah. Yeah, but to get serious, the world has really been indoors for the last couple of months, maybe more than that. And you've really had a global captive audience of the kind you've never known before.
That's
What do
right.
you think? What do you think the reader, the listener, the viewer, the surfer, what do you think they were looking at and looking for in the media? Was it just information in terms of news and analysis and insight, or was it just merely distraction of the kind you're talking about in terms of TikTok, in terms of games and sports and entertainment? And what were these trends that you noticed? Were they same across media platforms?
Well, I think most people turn to the big screen, so to speak, for film and video kind of entertainment. Most people these days have, at least in the US, have accounts like Netflix and Hulu and places like that where they get to watch full-length films and shows and things like that. And as you might have heard, a lot of complaints have centered around how there's no live sports, because obviously sports is a very big part of people's kind of recreational consumption. But in terms of straight news, I think there's a lot of appetite that has increased because of people's wanting to be more aware. And often there's been a kind of an interest in local news, what's going on in their community, because they want to know how many cases are going on around them and how many deaths in their community, and which store is closed, which store is open, who's delivering food and who's not. Those kinds of concerns have become much more prominent because they are hitting at the core of people's survival. It's about food, and so many of them, while being sheltered in their homes and kind of stranded in their homes, if you will, are looking for all these little signals from their immediate surroundings so that they can see how can they step out, how much they can step out. Some places public parks are open, some places public parks are closed. Some grocery stores are open, some liquor stores are not open, things like that. So they are very much concerned about this kind of very utility-based, functional kind of news. And in a larger situation, at least in the U.S., is the political drama that surrounds this. And so one of the big dramas has been, the daily coronavirus updates that come out of the White House, coronavirus task force, which until recently was kind of headed by Trump in terms of the briefings, at least. But that has been a fodder for a lot of late night, talk shows, but also, these panels and discussion shows on, channels like CNN. And so there is an avid kind of audience for it. It's more of an intellectual audience. And I think the vast majority, though, are tuning into more entertainment shows, tuning for distraction. And you can see that evidence of that even in social media feeds. A lot of kind of the conversation on Facebook and Twitter especially are about, what we can do to help each other or to amuse each other. And less about kind of the epidemiological and also the political aspects surrounding the COVID crisis. Twitter, to a little larger extent than Facebook, and that's historically been the case, is a little bit more informational and little less about interpersonal and community kind of collaborative sharing. But again, you see an overwhelming tendency for people to want to feel good, want to feel kind of assured from each other that the world is not coming apart. There are lots of people who post, sad stories looking for, compassion and support, and a lot of people out there, providing that. So in many ways, it's a kind of a petri dish of the humanity, so to speak, expressing everything in broad daylight or of online media.
So essentially, you're saying that people have used different kinds of screens for different kinds of activity or different kinds of engagement, right?
That's right. Yeah.
But I know we are in a lockdown, and I presume you're also at home, and I know many of your students and colleagues are also all in lockdown mode. But have you specifically commissioned anything by way of a study, or have you thought of anything like a study for this moment? What is it that you would be probing really?
Well, there are lots of angles through which one can study, especially those of us who are interested in, communication technologies and online media, and how exactly online media is playing a role with this crisis. We have a proposal in the works that is being, right now considered by a major social media grant program on how health misinformation is affecting individuals differently, especially the older people who are more vulnerable in this case. As you know, COVID disproportionately affects senior citizens than the younger folk. And so one of our projects is really looking at how misinformation can be particularly deadly for that segment of the population because they have less amount of literacy, so to speak, with digital tools in general. Of course, this is a stereotype, and of course there are exceptions. But in general, they tend to be groomed on traditional media, where they see something in published. They think of it as a sacred word, like we used to say printed word is a sacred word, and so for them who've grown up on newspapers and television newscasts, where journalists vet the facts, they do fact checking and verify the facts, and then only publish it. When they see what looks like a legitimate story on their news feeds, in their online social media feeds, they tend to be much more vulnerable to misinformation, and so they get easily bought into all these kind of quack remedies and do this and you will avoid COVID and all kinds of different things that are circulating in social media, as I'm sure you're aware, especially in platforms like WhatsApp, where it's not even open to scrutiny outside. The problem really with message platforms like WhatsApp is double encrypted, which means there's no way that somebody can provide a corrective information and tear that down like you would do on Twitter or Facebook. And so senior citizens who get these direct feeds of what looks like legitimate stories tend to be much more bought into those stories. They tend to believe that if a lot of other people have liked a story or forwarded a story, they think it's much more legitimate, without stopping to think that sometimes people who are trying to spread misinformation are employing bots that they themselves kind of program to go and just pepper it with many more likes. And bots are artificially inflating the metrics that are associated with some of these tweets, giving people the impression that this is indeed a very popular or well circulated story. And so older folks kind of lack that kind of filter or lens. Another example would be their ready willingness to believe in video stories compared to text stories. So these days, a lot of the fake information is through video stories, just like we saw with the child kidnappers a couple of years ago in India, where it was actually a PSA made by Pakistan television, which was misappropriated to make it look like there were a bunch of villagers, a bunch of people who came into the village and trying to kidnap your children. And that became viral and ended up with the mob lynching of several people, dozens of people in India. And that was a video story. And the reason why it had that kind of visceral reaction is because people, when they see something on video, they tend to believe it. The seeing is believing kind of thing is a very human trait. But what, digitally less savvy people don't stop to think is this could be easily manipulated. They're not, of course, aware of Photoshop and other ways of manipulating digital images, and as a result, they've kind of fall for these kinds of stories. So there are particular, tricks that are played on the minds of these less digitally savvy folks, and those unfortunately happen to be senior citizens, who unfortunately happen to be the more vulnerable in this particular crisis. And so we are kind of looking into how to flag stories that are specific to them in ways that could not only enhance their digital literacy, but also prevent them from taking action that might be detrimental to their health. So that's kind of just one example of a project where you can see how somebody like me, who's in a communication field, is thinking about this crisis and how it might be helpful going forth in kind of bringing some hygiene to the information environment online.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds absolutely valid as a story or as a research project. But to get back into our conversation, the textbook definition which all of us have been used to about the digital age is that this is the age of the connected world, the so-called global village. But we
Mhm.
know that Web 2.0 kind of overturned that and turned us all into little islands in a global ocean, really. So has this COVID pandemic really enlarged our worldview a little because of the scale, because of what it's doing to the whole world, or has it further reaffirmed our biases and prejudices by keeping us locked down inside a lockdown? What do you think it's happened?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and fertile ground for a lot of research. But the very nature of this disease is that it's highly networked, and so it's impossible, as we've realized, to kind of contain it within a country's borders or even within a state's borders because we are all so intertwined. Where previously, 100 years ago, perhaps, we could have very easily, closed all the borders and still carried on. But now our kind of lives are so intertwined that we cannot think of, not having some goods or commodities or people flying across nations or across oceans. And therefore, what happens in China is definitely going to percolate, through to Europe and through to US and through many other channels. And so it has, I think, made everyone realize how networked we are and that we are not able to be isolationists anymore, like some people, especially in the right wing in this country, are kind of want to believe. And so I think in general, people are realizing the network nature, but that does not mean that we don't, because we are kind of closeted in our own spaces and we are kind of meeting people who are in our immediate surroundings, often family, that we don't get to have that much of an exposure of different points of view, of different kind of arguments. So it could well be that a lot of us are, seeking out information that reaffirm our values, often our biases, kind of like an echo chamber effect. So this is a phenomenon that has kind of been already documented, where people, if they are not sufficiently provided corrective information, they tend to kind of go into only those portals or those online spaces which just reaffirm their kind of pre-existing biases. And so you see conservatives kind of flocking to Fox News and liberals flocking to MSNBC. And so they get more doses of the same kind of ideological kind of rabbit hole. And that kind of is inevitable, but it's something that is probably even more pronounced now because there's no corrective offline information, because people are not going out to bars and restaurants or gatherings and events where they might come across other people who might challenge them in a face-to-face setting. So in some ways, online media interaction kind of protects them from that kind of challenging worldview.
That's a great answer, really, really great answer. But obviously, humankind has seen pandemics before this, but this is clearly the very first one which has been so large, certainly the very first one in the social media era. Has modern media, given its kind of wide prevalence and ubiquity, helped in stalling the damage as opposed to previous pandemics, or has it failed looking at the toll in countries like yours? In other words, has social media really just kept people engaged and entertained and has not really done anything more than what previous pandemics enjoyed?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer because, especially because empirically we don't know what it could have been if it were not for social media, especially because of the kind of particular contagiousness of this virus. There's been a lot of social media campaigning for hand washing, for social distancing, and so forth. And you see that reiterated on all platforms and by all kinds of people shaming others for going out. or doing things. So social media has played a big role, I would say, in kind of enforcing a lot of the precautions that CDC and other authorities have kind of told us to undertake. But we cannot tell for sure if that has been as effective. Our only comparison point is to say, if it were not for social media, would there be more people on the streets? Would there be more people going out and getting infected? And my kind of just anecdotal observation is that probably yes. I think if it were not for social media, there would probably be more of an appetite for people to go out and socialize. If it were not for Zoom, I think people would just love the idea of even going and having a chat with a physical human being, whether it's a grocery store or a hardware store. They need that social contact. And so in some ways, I think social media have done a good job, or media in general, these online media, including video conferencing media like Zoom, have provided a buffer that has kind of at some level made people feel like that there's a way around this face-to-face social connection, and therefore we can still manage to get the social signals back and forth without having to necessarily go out. So my prediction is that without social media, we probably would be out in larger numbers and getting infected in larger numbers.
But on the flip side, of course, this pandemic has been used as an inflection point by governments across the world to drive home all kinds of intrusive surveillance software in the name of tracing. How do you look at these apps and technologies which are designed to keep tabs on people at all time? And in that sense, has mass media actually been a useful tool in the hands of governments to condition the masses in the name of controlling the disease?
Well, I think this is a reflection of a paradox that we call the personalization privacy paradox in the literature, where it has existed even before this crisis. As online media have become increasingly personalized, we love the fact that Netflix knows us, knows our tastes, and gives us the movies that we particularly like based on our profile or past viewing history. We love the fact that when we go to Amazon or some e-commerce website, it kind of knows what we are looking for, or what recommends things based on what our friends brought and so forth. So in that way, these different technologies that have come together to personalize our media experience come at a cost. On the one hand, it's very convenient, it gives you what you want, but on the other hand, in order to do that, it needs to pry into your prior viewing history or your prior purchasing history and things like that, or drop cookies and find out exactly where you've been in order to kind of know you, so to speak, so that it can serve you better. And so there's been a lot of public outcry. In fact, Shoshana Zuboff recently wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism. And essentially what she means is this whole personalization, taking away the human agency that comes along with our privacy. And likewise, you see this with any technology that tries to individualize your experience. If indeed you have to individualize your particular risk profile to be able to say that Krishna Prasad is 70% likely to have COVID positive exposure, in order to individualize it to that extent, to that one person, they also need to be that intrusive to kind of get at Krishna Prasad's contacts and your background and your different activities. And so in some countries, people have kind of reconciled to this. I think South Korea is an example where historically people have been a little bit more comfortable with even revealing their social security number. There are blog posts back in the day when blogs were a big thing. In South Korea, people would have to sign on their blog entries, even comments, with their social security number, essentially so that they can prove that they are not an anonymous kind of troll. And so in some countries, that equation between service and sacrifice of your personal freedom have been higher, or that equation is much more even than in other countries. Like the US, for example, there's a huge outcry. There's no way that the average American would allow that level of contact tracing like you would see, let's say, in Singapore. And so, that is a tension. That is a very important tension that we face with technology marching forward. We have the ability to pinpoint, but that ability to pinpoint also takes away individual human agency. Just the other day I was filing my tax return, so my interactions with my accountant now, where it used to be through mail, I would send all my tax organizer with all my information, including sensitive information like income and so forth, through a mail, through registered mail. Now I'm having to send it by email, and I stop to wonder, now this is going through so many servers. While on the one hand, it's very convenient to be able to do all this tax-related transactions with my accountant online. That convenience comes at a cost of potential lapse in security and by extension privacy.
But very briefly, after this pandemic, what do you think? Is free speech across the world stronger or weaker? Very briefly.
Well, I think in general, the pandemic has opened the doors for the limits of free speech. And of course, it depends on how you define free speech, but the ability for everyone to have a say, I think, has dramatically increased. And you do see that now in full form across all kinds of media, especially, of course, in social media. And so, I think it's definitely on the rise rather than on the decline. But it has also shown the ability of certain governments to completely shut down or cut down traffic, internet traffic. But then there are technologies that can bypass that, as you've seen in places like China and Hong Kong, where there are these other apps that can bypass traditional government surveillance. So there are anti-surveillance technologies that kind of subvert these kinds of surveillance. And so that's ultimately, I think, to the benefit of the average user.
Yeah. You did speak, of course, of fake news and misinformation earlier, but, given the scale of this pandemic, we have seen social media being used to spread fake news and misinformation and disinformation, even in mature democracies like yours. What does this increasing use and embrace of unfiltered social media as the chief source of news, even in a largely news illiterate market like India, mean? What happens when you ditch the printed word and spend so much time staring passively at a screen?
Well, I think in many ways, this is what I meant earlier about news finds me. People don't feel like that they need to actively kind of look for information and search for the right sources. Instead, they kind of get into the mindset of, if it's important, it's going to kind of find me. And so they find that they are bombarded with all kinds of news. And what most people psychologically, even at this stage of our kind of evolution in this domain, don't really factor in is the fact that my friend, who's a social media friend, does not have the journalistic skills and ability and background to verify the facts before transmitting that story to me.
Yeah.
So I think there's been a general undervaluation of journalistic sourcing in this new domain, and overvaluation of the journalistic abilities of laypersons. And you don't stop to think that your friend or your neighbor who sent you that story doesn't have gatekeeping ability, doesn't have any way to kind of fact check the stories. And so we are now bombarded with this stream of stories where we are just taking it in as if they're all coming from mainstream media. And so the bottom line with this is the real estate that it's going to take up. amount of the screen that is going to be taken up by this kind of misinformation compared to the real information that's coming from vetted sources and journalistic sources and so forth. So for me, the problem sheet needs to be tackled at the source level, and therefore we need kind of a whole new suite of technologies which kind of create a kind of a flag, so to speak, a gate, so to speak, on your phone that basically allows these legitimate sources to get in, but these kind of informal sources to not necessarily not get in, but to kind of be in a separate channel so that people can consume them for their amusement. There are a lot of there's a lot of research evidence that suggests that people do know that it's fake story and still read it and still forward it. And there's even some data that said 60% of tweets are forwarded without people even reading the story that's underlying the headline. They just read the headline and then they forward that story. And so that's a phenomenon that is very rampant because a lot of us are just processing information in a very heavy overload situation. And so people might like fake stories. People might even forward them saying, knowing that it's fake and saying, look, there are even stories like this that are circulating. And so others, of course, in their network might not have the same filters to recognize the kind of satire value of this, and they might actually take it on face value. And so there are lots of complications on how people receive the news. So ultimately, I think the best solution would be to have some automated way of kind of distinguishing the different sources so that people get a diet of information that is well vetted and journalistically proper through professional sources, and other information that may not be as professionally sourced for entertainment purposes through another channel.
Well, of course, in the United States and also in Brazil, the additional problem is that the man at the top peddles fake news and actually delegitimizes mainstream media. So I think that also helps in this process of spreading fake news. But why do you think aggregators have been unable to rein in fake news even at a time like this? I know that after the 2016 election, some of these firms were, hauled up and so on. But it seems to be that they're absolutely unwilling to rein in fake news, even with something like this, which is a life and death issue, really.
Yeah. I mean, the all indications are that they are trying. It's not like that they've been, lax on it or they've given up. So there's been doubling down of effort in terms of trying to have fact checkers fact check. But the real issue that I feel is the pace is not adequate. That is, the pace with which misinformation is actually being produced is far surpassing the capabilities of the moderation methods that are kind of in place right now by various fact-checking organizations, various social media organizations, including Facebook. So it takes a while for news to be detected, fake news to be detected, and then kind of downranked. In the meantime, it's already spread and created damage, like you said, sometimes life and death kind of issue. And so this kind of imbalance in the pace with which fake news is produced and kind of taken down can only be solved, with some kind of artificial intelligence technology. In fact, my colleagues and I are working on a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation, which is basically to design an algorithm that would detect fake news as it comes in, and therefore kind of creates all kinds of flags that this is satire or this is opinion or this is commentary and things like that, that would pretty much automatically do it at a scale that is not possible by human moderators. It would do, hundreds of stories for each second. And that's the scale you need. That's the kind of scaling you need for the amount of misinformation that's being produced day in and day out.
Well, of course, in the US, it's a little simpler because it's one language or a couple of languages at best. But India would be a very different story. But to get back to fake news, it played a very big role in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. We are now in the middle of another election year. And what do you suspect? Have the tech majors kind of tightened up their act, or do you think the fake news peddlers are still one step ahead?
Well, it's a cat and mouse game. I mean, the moment you have some kind of solution, and in fact, Twitter and Facebook, the two big platforms, have announced various initiatives. There are these fake news peddlers that are finding a way around it. And you'll find this especially with people who are able to, fund their fake news campaigns independently. The one thing that I think is going to be different is maybe we can potentially rule out the fake news that come out of an economic incentive, like the Macedonian kids who are creating these little fake news stories and making $1,000 here and there, which is big money in Macedonia. But they were creating stories that were anti-Trump and creating stories that were anti-Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election and seeding them in the social media feeds just to get a lot of traffic based upon which they were paid. And now, Facebook especially has instituted ways in which those kinds of incentives are not going to be awarded. And so that pocket of fake news production might stop. But then there are other ingenious ways, like the alleged Russian involvement through sophisticated bots, those kinds of things that are funded, through governments or other such powerful entities. They'll always find ways to kind of circumvent the current safeguards that social media have. And it's going to be an ongoing, cat and mouse game through the election season.
Yeah. Again, very briefly, after the 2016 election, the tech firms were hauled up for their role. But do you think do you foresee a situation where they are again hauled up vis-a-vis COVID? Do you think tech firms will be held responsible if this toll gets out of hand quickly?
Well, I think in general, there's been greater realization by social media companies that they are no longer a mere platform, that they are indeed at some level publishers. For a long time, they used to deny that they were actually publishers and that they were not legally accountable. Even after the 2016 election, I think Mark Zuckerberg came out and said that it's ridiculous that people would think that Facebook could sway the elections. But I think they've all now come around to the realization that they are actually publishers, and they all have professional journalists very often at the helm. And I think they're taking all kinds of precautions. So if they're hauled up, it'll be for, just a stock taking of what went wrong and not maybe accountability. I don't think they'll be held culpable or accountable for some novel publication, which they didn't intend to do. Right now, they're all, I think, in the business of publishing, and they don't know that. They're fully aware of it.
Yeah. So, Shyam, let's get into the last couple of questions because I know you got to run. Even before the pandemic broke, the US president was urging countries not to entertain the Chinese in their 5G plans. Now with what we've seen with the pandemic and China's role in the origin of it, do you think the economic chips are being further rearranged? Do you think countries will be kind of forced to ditch Huawei or other 5G players from China after COVID?
Well, to the extent there's any kind of suspicion of state involvement, I think there's a decent chance that will happen. I think there is a kind of dual threat against China. One is the kind of the bias that exists now because of the widespread kind of belief that China had something to do with this origin of this virus, and even the fact that they hid some of the information in the early days. And so I think there's all kinds of backlash against China for that reason, essentially holding China responsible for this crisis. And then furthermore, Huawei and other scandals that have kind of preceded this crisis kind of hit at Chinese surveillance technology and their kind of military intelligence. And so in that way, I think there's going to be a lot of hesitation on the part of pretty much the rest of the world in terms of trading with China on many fronts, and there's going to be that the brakes are going to come on, and it's going to be just the economically deprived countries, probably often African countries, that are going to really listen to China and toe the line. It's going to be a long time before China comes back at the negotiating table in a powerful way.
Yeah. And finally, Shyam, even in the middle of your staggering academic accomplishments, you've been a jazz music DJ for a long time at PSU's FM station. And I noticed from the website of Lion 90.7 FM that you haven't, updated your jazz list since March 11th. Have you been doing it from home, or when do you hope to restart if you haven't?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is actually a radio station that's tied to the campus, and the campus completely shut down for non-essential services. Even though some of us think jazz is essential, we are not allowed to even go into our studios and do our shows. And the timing was such that it did not let us set up alternate broadcasting channels. So we are a very small operation. We are not like the big broadcasters. So we didn't have the technical kind of background to be able to hook all the DJs up with a system that they could broadcast from their homes. And most of the people involved are students and faculty, and they're all kind of really scattered all over right now, making it very difficult to run a station. So our university, I guess, decided that this is non-essential at this point. So I'm looking forward to the day that I can go back into the studios and continue my show and resume my show. Yeah. And I have been posting on my Facebook posts in all kinds of venues where my listeners can get jazz, including live jazz by performers. And those are one of the nicer things that are coming out of these, this kind of quarantine period.
Quickly, what 3 pieces of music would you recommend to Indian listeners?
Well, there's all kinds of jazz music. Oh my God, that's a huge list that I can rattle off. It's a very tough question. You put me in a spot, but I think if you've not heard, there's some fantastic music by Vijay Iyer, who's a jazz pianist of Indian origin, that he's been doing some fantastic work with Rudresh Mahantapa. And so, in fact, Rudresh Mahantapa actually did some work with Kadri Gopalnath, who passed away recently, as you might know. And they've done some excellent kind of crossover Indo-jazz, a fusion kind of music. So I would recommend that you guys listen to that. You can also go to Blue Note, which is the famous New York City jazz club. On their website, they've now started having world-class musicians coming live from their homes and performing in concert. And also Jazz at Lincoln Center, which is headed by Wynton Marsalis. They also have started putting their archives all on public, so you can actually literally watch jazz concerts from the comfort of your home.
Yeah. Well, that Rudresh Mahantapa album you're talking of with Kadri Gopalnath was called Kinsman, and it's a fine album and something worth listening to. But one last question, Shyam. You were also a journalist in India before you went off to the US. You worked for City Tab, you wrote for the Deccan Herald and Indian Express oftentimes, and you've seen the media inside out from your extraordinary position where you are. What one piece of advice would you have for Indian journalists who, in a sense, are actually seeing the writing on the wall?
Well, I would say don't despair, because I think that the appetite for news has increased, if anything, and that there's been a tremendous upsurge in terms of the psychological value of news. People have seen what misinformation can do, what damage it can do, and I think the power of journalism is even more felt now than ever before. The only reason why you might feel like you're in a struggling industry is because the revenue models are not worked out on how to kind of actually make this equation work between quality journalism and quality readership, and in fact quantity readership now, because it's going up every day. The kind of the old model of relying on advertising is the one that it needs to go, but not necessarily the equation between journalists and readers.
Well, Dr. Sethuraman Shyam Sundar, friend, professor, and DJ, Thank you very much for joining me on this episode of JPod. Here's hoping that you and your family, both in the US and here in India, stay safe during these trying times. And I look forward to talking to you very soon. And that's
Thank you.
JPod. Yeah, and that's JPod
Thank you
for
so much,
today.
Krishna. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that's JPod for today. I will see you soon on Sunday with another episode on journalists and journalism. Thank you very much if you've been listening. Thank you so much.